Disagrees Communal Sense podcast. My name is Amanda MacDonald. Today we have with us Jeremey Parkhurst. He's an 11-year veteran analyst with the Department of Defense. Jeremey has received his bachelor's in political science in 2001 from Colorado Boulder and his master's in foreign affairs from the University of Oklahoma Norman in 2010. Jeremey has also been published by King's College, University of Cambridge. Today, Jeremey is with us to discuss the Israel-Palestinian conflict and determine what is the best lens to analyze this issue through, the role of the United States, and much more. Jeremey, it's great to have you on the podcast. How you feeling today? How you
Good.
doing?
Hey, thanks for having me on, Amanda.
Yeah, of course. So I figured let's just hop right into it. Why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of who you are, what you do, and why this conflict is important?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have to say first and foremost that these views, or anything I talk about during the podcast, are my views only and not that of the Department of Defense. So just want to get that out of the way first and foremost. But certainly, yeah, so as you mentioned, I currently work with the Department of Defense as an analyst. Before that, I was an intelligence officer with the United States Air Force. And so no matter what line of work or what area you focus at within foreign policy or the intelligence community, Israel touches a lot of that, and you can't not examine Israel without understanding the Palestinian conflict and how that's shaped. So, I've dealt indirectly and then directly with this problem set through various times throughout my career. So.
Okay, so where can you kind of give us a little overview of the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and then kind of where you stand on the issue personally?
Yeah, certainly. So for most people, they kind of look at 1947 as the seminal moment, once the British mandate ended with the Israeli Declaration of Independence and then the corresponding war with the Palestinians and the neighboring Arab states. I would argue, though, it really kind of you can't look at Israel and Palestine without going back at least to World War I with the Ottoman Empire. Kind of, even though it was called the dying man of Europe, really everything was atrophying with the Ottoman Empire at that point, whether it be their holdings in Southwest Asia or North Africa or in Europe. So it was already sort of crumbling at that point in time. Once the British and the French kicked the Ottomans out, there was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which essentially carved Lebanon and Syria underneath a French mandate, and then Israel under a British mandate. Post World War I, you started seeing more Jewish migration to the area.
Right, as a result of the Holocaust and everything.
Well, even before that, it was already starting to pick up with Zionism. So in 1922, about 13% of the population within Palestine, or the area we now call Israel and Palestine, was about 13% Jewish. By 46, partially because of obviously a lot to do with the Holocaust, but even with just rising anti-Semitism throughout the Axis powers, in the 30s, it had already gone up to 33%. So
right, so that's like a mass. That's
right,
like
absolutely.
Doubling
Yeah, we complain about illegal immigration here, and it's like it was immigration to the point where it was dramatically changing the very fabric of that population center at that point in time. But you're absolutely right. And then post-Holocaust, there was a lot of political will across the world to make amends, for lack of a better word. So,
right.
And Zionism, in kind of my opinion, was an easy way to say, look, we're trying to make amends. Here you go. We're gonna make a Jewish home state for you, and then
right,
obviously
so you can be protected against the anti-Semitism that exists.
Right, absolutely,
Europe.
Yeah. And so then it led to a series of wars in 47, 48 with the Israelis won, and then 67, and then 73, which in the end Israel always ended up either on top or at least kind of on the winning side of it, if you will, either by their own military prowess but oftentimes because of U.S. direct supplies and sort of advice to help them out. So post 73, it really became more of an issue of Israel was clearly in the dominant position at that point in time, and then finally in 79, you had the famous peace treaty with the Egyptians where they gave back the Sinai Peninsula, and Egypt became the first Arab state to actually formally recognize Israel. And then there was finally progress in the early 90s with the Oslo Accords. That stalled out several intifadas later. There was a failed Camp David summit in 2000. And then really since then, we've just been mired in this situation where there's, in theory, a push for a two-state solution but the reality on the ground doesn't match that anymore. So.
Right, because the two-state solution, from what I saw, at least during the mandates anyway, it separated out the area in such a way where it almost looked like a gerrymandered state, where it wasn't even really, it wasn't primarily in the north. You have Palestinians primarily in the south.
Right.
You have Israelis. It was kind of...
Yeah, so the only contiguous part is Gaza, in the very south west corner of Israel, right along the Egyptian border. That's the only contiguous spot for the Palestinians. And you're absolutely right. The West Bank is a hodgepodge because there's been a steady increase of Israeli or Jewish settlers going into the West Bank, most illegally, some legally. That has just made it where it's not a continuous. There would be no way to set it up, essentially, to have a unified West Bank control by the Palestinians without having a significant number of Jewish settlers under Palestinian rule. And this is my opinion. I can't. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Even though there are, 20% of the Israeli official Israeli population is are Arabs or Palestinians. Mm-hmm. I can't see that working the inverse in the West Bank. I can't see Israel allowing that to happen.
Right. Of course.
Yeah.
Okay, so given this conflict centuries-long history then, and you mentioned Zionism, do you picture this more as a nationalistic issue or more of a religious issue? Because a lot of people sometimes conflate the two. Right.
And I might conflate it with my answer, to be honest, because I think it is a great question. I struggle to answer that one just because it's such a complex issue, obviously.
Right.
And I'll probably answer your question in a way that doesn't actually answer it, so I apologize. I'm not trying to give a politician's answer. But on the nationalistic side, I would argue there's many Arabs that don't look at Palestinians as actually being Arab. They're a distinct group from the Arabs in a lot of ways. But then you also recognize that Arab support is the primary driving factor for keeping sort of the Palestinian rejectionist groups like Hamas up and running. Where I would argue it's almost more of a religious conflict is actually here within the United States. If I can kind of turn the question on its head a little bit, and I apologize if I'm going in a direction you don't want to go with
no,
it.
That's okay.
You can feel free to rein me in. But, if you look at it, support for Israel within the United States is primarily from evangelical Protestants.
Right.
Most Jews, obviously, within the United States, obviously have some level of support for Israel. But I would argue, for instance, Trump keeps saying publicly, with the King of the Jews comment and everything,
right.
kind of not understanding why more Jewish Americans aren't supporting him. Really, the hard line that this administration takes plays really well for evangelical Christians. So, in a sense, it's a religious conflict insofar that the major external player, the United States, has an administration that is playing to its base because of a religious connection that evangelical Protestants feel towards Israel, if that makes sense. So even though most Jewish Americans here don't support Trump, they don't support a lot of the hardline things that Trump is doing. So in a weird way, it is more of a religious conflict, but I would argue not in the ways that most people think. It's the internal domestic U.S. politics that is driving a lot of us as the dominant player, influencing how the situation is playing out. Because we've long been sort of the umbrella at the international level for the Israelis, and I would argue if the U.S. were to take a hard line against Netanyahu and some of the current policies that are not favoring a two-state solution, they probably wouldn't be happening right now.
Okay. So you think that the administration's position on Israel is, do you think that's more of like a we want to get reelected kind of thing, and that's his evangelical base, and so he's all about calling Israel an independent nation by itself? Because I know that he came out and he did that before.
Yeah. Well, and so, for instance, he moved the embassy to Jerusalem, which
right.
and then got absolutely nothing in return politically. Like, that's clearly something that's just being done to play to the base. And I think, not to slip into domestic politics, but I think we can all agree that Trump, whether you hate him or love him, plays to his base. There's no attempt to sort of bridge or to build bridges. It's definitely a play to the base.
Right.
And can he win with less than 50% of the vote? But I would argue even pre-Trump, most of the U.S. foreign policy towards Israel has usually been geared with the domestic audience in mind, going all the way back to Truman, especially in the late 40s, there was domestic support for the concept of Israel. Obviously, there are more Jewish Americans than Muslim Americans, or clearly Palestinian Americans. So it tends to play well domestically. AIPAC is a massive influence on both parties. So I would argue really most political decisions the U.S. has, or most foreign policy decisions the U.S. has made over the last several decades vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine has been more with the domestic lens in mind, because the repeated top cover that the U.S. gives to Israel doesn't really play well within South and West Asia. By and large, it's getting better now, but let's be honest, like, you're not really helping out relations with Arab nations if you continually support Israel and kind of protect them, especially at the UN, from certain resolutions.
Right, because I realized that after the mandates, after the British mandates, when Britain kind of realized, oh man, we really messed this up trying to destabilize the Ottoman Empire, they just kind of handed it over to the United Nations. And they were like, here you go.
Absolutely.
Please fix this for us, because we don't know what we've done here.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're right. Like, and they were in the middle of unwinding their empire. It was just, we're out. Yeah.
All right. So it's nationalistic on the ground, but more religious in the United States. And you were talking a little bit about the United States being like an umbrella. So on the ground in the Middle East, how do you think they kind of, and by they I obviously mean Israel and Palestine, what role do you think they believe the United States is playing? Is it a positive role? Is it a negative role? Is it exacerbating the issue, making it worse?
Well, definitely on the Palestinian side, and this isn't really my opinion, you can just find it, through, public statements throughout most Palestinian leaders. It's, especially under this administration, it's not viewed as being a positive influence on the ground there. Really, with Israel, I would argue we have more leverage over Israeli actions than any other nation. But this administration has decided to sort of step back from having leverage. Obama would at least, traditionally there's been at least a bipartisan sort of understanding that we will support Israel, but if push comes to shove, we can really try to put influence on them to not exacerbate the situation. So sometimes they've been able to pressure Israel into stopping some of the West Bank settlements that under this current administration, there's no desire to put any leverage. So, definitely, I think there's a sense of disappointment on the Palestinian side. Really, increasingly for the Arab nations surrounding it, it's less of an issue than it used to be. You don't really hear about Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia really saying much publicly against the Israelis anymore. It just doesn't play like it used to domestically. And so, but then I would argue, so there, if there's sense of disappointment on the Palestinian side, there's definitely especially within Netanyahu and that coalition, I think extreme satisfaction with what they've got going on right now.
With the Trump administration,
absolutely, because there's no one
not
really
having to give anything back.
Absolutely, yeah.
Like with the embassy, like you were saying, there's no leverage, no leverage.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So, aside from Trump, obviously is a hard change as far as the leverage is concerned. But traditionally, with the United States, from Truman to Obama, kind of what were there changes in American diplomacy there? Do you think that really, again, exacerbated the issue, made it worse, or made it better? Because I know that Bill Clinton got really close, and then it just kind of flopped. And
you're absolutely right with the Camp David summit of 2000, and ultimately the Palestinians walked away from the table on that. The problem is, and now you have Jared Kushner with one of his thousands of jobs is supposed to solve this process, and it's a joke, my opinion, because everything is based, what he's put out publicly is based off investment, and no one in their right mind would invest in the region right now. It's why, when you're one conflict away from having it all wiped out all over again. So sorry to kind of get back. So really, I would argue with the U.S. It's been both positive and negative, and it really just depends on the administration at the time and what they were able to accomplish. So obviously Carter pushing for peace in '79 paid big dividends because at least it removed one existential threat from Israel insofar of Egypt. And so it created, at least in theory, if you believe if peace can build upon peace, there's been benefits throughout time, especially with Carter and with Clinton. And then the second Bush at least tried, but he got mired down in 9/11, so it just sort of stopped everything after that. And I would argue at this point, there's been so much damage done to a two-state solution. I'm not really sure even what the U.S. can do to unwind the damage that's been done. You can't just shut down these settlements that have hundreds of thousands of settlers in the West Bank now. You just can't kind of go back to getting Gaza and West Bank under Palestinian control, or one Palestinian governing control. And so I don't even know how at this point the U.S. can solve the issue, but it still has enough influence, obviously, to make it better or worse. And you kind of already know my opinion on the current state of things.
Yeah, true. Okay, so I wanted to get in a little bit on the domestic politics side too, because I've been hearing a lot about, like we were talking about before, how the Palestinian issue is a gay issue. I've also heard that Hamas is essentially a terrorist organization, and how is it possible that you can pretty much rally all of the Palestinians underneath a terror organization and then try to broker peace with them. Ben Shapiro even said at one point on one of his podcasts that if the Jews essentially, if Israel essentially won, and there would be peace tomorrow, but if the Palestinians were given authority and having their own nation, that they would kill all the Israelis essentially. And so I'm kind of wondering what your opinion is on those.
Sure. So it's funny, the Shapiro comment, because it kind of reminds me in certain ways that Netanyahu likes to point out that Israel is the only actual democracy within the region.
Right.
And so it's sort of always this the messaging that, you know, we are a more responsible group of people. So it's funny you say that. I apologize. Could you rephrase that first part of the question? Because you had a few things, and I apologize.
No, that's okay. So getting back to the domestic politics issue, we were talking before about how we had heard, or how I had heard a little bit about how it was a gay issue, that the Palestinian issue was a gay issue. Recently, Ilhan Omar came out and she said that she was basically giving support to gay Palestinians. And then I've also had a hard time myself trying to reconcile how it is that we're not supposed to negotiate with terrorists, but Hamas, being a terrorist organization, is the only central control that the Palestinians have right now, or the only central voice, I guess.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, no, and you're absolutely spot on. There is definitely a terror angle involved with this. The Palestinian Authority as you mentioned, doesn't have control of Gaza. So Gaza falls under the control of Hamas because there was a split several years back. The one thing I would argue is, and you're right, like we have an open policy of not negotiating with terrorists, although we
do kind
coincidentally
of
forget that across administrations. At one point you could argue, or it was legitimate to call the Palestinian Liberation Organization a terrorist organization. They did airjackings. They conducted terrorist attacks, and Yasser Arafat, as the leader of that, would by definition be a terrorist.
Right.
And we sort of saw the same thing with Sinn Féin up in Northern Ireland. So it is a reality that you can't separate most Palestinians with authority, and I don't mean to say the Palestinian Authority, but just Palestinians in a position of power.
Right.
Their hands are dirty in some way, shape, or form. So then do you take a realpolitik view of, the facts on the ground are, if you want to get anything done, you're going to have to deal with people with a less than 100% clean history, to put it very, very politely.
Right.
And by no means am I trying to defend Hamas and what that organization stands for and what it's done. It's just a reality. When you've been beaten conventionally as a military force,
right,
you're going to find a way to, and it's the cliche comment of one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. So,
right.
Yes, there is definitely that. And even some of the groups pushing for the recent failed congressional visit to Israel, they have second and third order connections to terrorist organizations. And so I don't have a good answer for you on that one. I think it's a realization that if you want to get something done, you're going to have to deal with the facts as they are, not as we want them to be.
Right. I guess that makes sense, because I know that Rashida Tlaib was trying to say that she wanted to go see her grandmother, but then on their itinerary between her and Ilhan Omar, they weren't meeting anyone with Israel. And I also know that the Democrats have recently split, not going to any Israeli functions whatsoever, and that's relatively new. And I'm kind of wondering, like, where that came from. Where do you see that shift? Where did that shift happen at?
Right, and so you're raising a really good point, and up until really this administration, well, it started fraying with the last administration, but really up until this decade, this was definitely a very bipartisan issue. Like support for Israel that's an easy one,
right?
And whereas now I think it is more reflective of there's definitely a conflict within the Democratic Party, because it's just, as you've said, like there especially is elements within the like Democratic, representatives or, Dems in the House and the Senate are now sort of divorcing themselves from certain Israeli functions.
Right.
At the end of the day, with the boycott, divestments, and sanction, the act
BDS.
that came out earlier this year, I think I want to say like 22 or so Democratic senators joined Republicans in passing that bill. So it's a reflection that I think within the Democratic Party of you've got a newer wing that is more liberal, more looking at this as this generation's apartheid, and you've still got an old school Democratic views within a lot of the party that this is an easy bipartisan issue that plays well across the spectrum.
So do you think that, because it's obvious to me now that between the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, between some Democrats being more liberals than others, that we have a split in the Democratic Party that's such a fracture that you almost can't even recognize the Democratic Party, at least the far left wing of the Democratic Party. And I'm wondering, you're kind of a more liberal guy, not to put all your politics out there, but how do you see the Democratic Party being able to move forward and actually win elections if they're so fractured on an issue that at one point was, like you were saying, too easy?
Yeah. So if you look at history as a guide, I'm not trying to equate Israel to South Africa, even though but if you look at history as a guide, during the 80s, the Republican Party was sort of dealing with the same issue in a sense, because Reagan was a very, very public supporter of South Africa. He vetoed sanctions. It got overrode by the Senate, but there was sort of this split within the Republican Party, especially with when they actually had moderates at one point in time, Northeast moderates, and then the rest of the party were kind of at odds with how to deal with South Africa. And then there were still concerns that, well, if you don't back the current regime in South Africa, the then current regime in South Africa, they're a bulwark for communism, all that stuff that seems ludicrous now, but was like a thing back then. And then even on the Democratic side, sort of, you had more Southern Democrats that were more sympathetic to South Africa. So in a sense, both parties had splits. And so I don't know if this will answer it, but at some point it became obvious that what South Africa was doing was immoral, unethical, and demanded a response. So sort of people who within the two respective parties sort of, I guess, just for lack of a better term, just shut up and just sort of colored. But we're not to a point where, I'm totally dating myself here, but Lethal Weapon 2, the main bad guys were a bunch of South Africans. Like, I don't see us doing some sort of like current Hollywood action film in which the Israeli ambassador or the Israeli consulate in Los Angeles are the main bad guys. So that's why I'm a little reticent to use South Africa as an example. But I think there is going to be a point where, and this is just a prediction, that there will be more of a recognition that certain Israeli policies are not in line with who we espouse to be as individuals who are about freedom, who are about one person, one vote.
Right.
And so I do tend to think at some point the Dems will continually coalesce around what is becoming an increasingly unpopular Israel. And I don't mean Israel as just existing. I just mean Israel insofar of how it treats the Palestinian problem set.
Right, and I feel like that puts the United States in a precarious position because we're, like we were talking about before, it's the only democracy in the Middle East, and how do we reconcile the fact that we want to kind of promote democracy in all these Middle Eastern places and then turn around and also say, I'm not sure that we can do that. Let's give this back to the Palestinians, who are also a terrorist organization. Wouldn't that kind of undermine the United States' hegemonic value in the international system?
I want to give a snide comment of I don't know how much credibility we have left right now, so I'm not really sure how much more damage we could do to our own credibility as we unsuccessfully bought Greenland last week.
Right. I thought that was kind of funny, though.
Yeah. I really feel, and this is just my opinion once again, that even if we are willing to work with more on the Palestinian Authority side and less on Hamas, that it will still play well internationally because there is just a general sense of support for the Palestinian people. So I think no matter who we deal with, we're going to kind of get away with it, if that makes sense. Because if you look at all the UN resolutions that the Palestinian Authority keeps putting up, they pass with overwhelming numbers, and then we usually veto it straight down. But what I'm saying is I think there's enough international support that whoever we deal with, but hopefully it would be more on the Palestinian Authority side.
Right.
I don't think we would look too hypocritical. But you raise a really good point, because how do you claim to, if we even do that anymore, because I would argue under this current administration they don't really talk about exporting democracy.
No, not really.
Yeah, but even if we still in theory do, we kind of briefly talked about it before the podcast. What do you do if you put the entire territory into one nation? You quickly realize that they're almost, and with the birth rates of Palestinians, within, and I don't know the exact numbers, within a decade or two, there will be more Palestinians than Jews if current trends continue.
Right.
And then, so we already had do you just gerrymander it like North Carolina to keep it being a Jewish state when there won't be a Jewish majority at that point in time?
Right. You wouldn't be able to do something like that because then it wouldn't really be like a real democracy at that point. But I worry that Hamas is so powerful that the Palestinian Authority isn't going to have enough play in their hand to be able to actually facilitate a solution that makes sense. And we're going to end up having to deal with an organization that, from what I can tell, Americans generally feel is a terror organization. Yeah. I feel like it puts us in a weird spot. Yeah.
No, you're absolutely... This whole problem set is one weird spot, I think.
Oh, yeah, so true.
Maybe I'm being an optimist, but I tend to think if the Palestinian Authority is empowered and they can actually convince Palestinians that there is a peaceful way to get their issues resolved, I tend to look at Gaza as an example of when you don't feel you can get that way with the current political environment, that empowers Hamas. So I don't have any hard facts to back this up, but I would just generally think, on average, people are more willing to give peace a chance if they actually feel that there's that they're empowered and that there's a way through that system. And that generally, in my mind, undercuts support for organizations like Hamas, because they feed off fear. They feed off a need for violence.
Peace obviously doesn't work. Come with us.
Yeah. Like strain. So we oftentimes sort of inadvertently empower more violent organizations, and I think Gaza is a perfect example of that. If you're a Palestinian, you're stuck in a 30-mile strip, and you can't get out, and you're dependent on limited international support, and you live, one rocket attack away from potentially just being collateral damage.
Right.
I think you're usually more willing to hear someone out who says things that are not conducive towards peace.
Yeah, that's fair. All right, so we brought up BDS before, the boycott and sanctions and everything. From what I've seen about it, Israel has basically said that BDS is a kind of like a version 2.0 of 1947 type era, where they were trying to use economics as a means to destabilize Israel, and they were saying that it was kind of like economic terrorism or something like that. What are your thoughts on that? And is BDS valuable, and is it a good idea?
Right. Great questions. You're absolutely right. Most Israelis and I'll keep it as most Israelis because I really don't want to try to say what the collective global Jewish thoughts are on BDS. But most, at least I'll play it safe. Opponents of BDS can rightfully point out that some supporters of BDS are anti-Semites. Pure and simple, that there are elements that are anti-Semitic that clearly look at BDS, even though that's not the method that they would choose. They're at a minimum sympathetic to it, and it's easy to just verbally support something like that. So you're absolutely there are definitely elements, very unsavory elements that back BDS. That being said, BDS is kind of a thorn for all sides because obviously it riles up the Israeli state. They are clearly, the government is trying to formulate a response to BDS. But BDS can also create problems for Arab states that actually want to trade with Israel, want to actually sort of overtly have more positive relations with Israel because it puts pressure on them. So it's not an... But what I find fascinating about BDS, either way, is I think it is potentially a chance to reframe the issue. Because up until now, we keep trying to solve it with a two-state solution.
Right,
and
which
BDS
doesn't work.
Yeah, BDS doesn't... It's not trying to go for a two-state solution.
Right.
So I'm not saying it's the right thing, but I just find it very interesting that it is a post-two-state solution to pressuring Israel into going to the bargaining table and trying to hammer out something. It's funny because kind of like abortion, where it will rally, though, certain conservative elements within the United States. So there was this case during Hurricane Harvey. There was a small little town, like suburb, sort of, I think it was like Dickinson or something like that. This little neighborhood that's its own town. But they were trying to they got sued by the ACLU, but they were trying to make hurricane victims sign, in order to get funding and to get like relief services, they had to sign a thing saying that they would not support any boycott of Israel. Like, if you're in Dickinson, Texas, when are you going to deal with a situation where you're confronted with boycotting Israel?
Right.
So I do think it sends a signal, though, that it definitely has at least supporters of the current Israeli policies at least concerned.
Right.
And I think it's just going to continue to grow. I think especially it seems BDS has far more support with more, with younger populations. It's definitely growing in support within Europe. It's having some impact because even Canada, not long ago, any wine that comes out of Israel, if it's in Palestinian territory, it has to be declared differently than if it's from a vineyard in Israel. So I think it's going to keep growing. And as it grows, I think there will be more and more sort of opposition and support. I really don't know where it's going because this isn't quite like apartheid. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, exactly. If I knew where it was going, I wouldn't be here right now.
Right.
I'd be making lots of money at Vegas. But so we kind of talked about the BDS bill earlier.
Yeah.
That was just a very symbolic thing, right? There's no way Pelosi is going to take that up in the House. It's just way too divisive for a lot of the reasons you already mentioned. It would fracture the Dems. So it was a very symbolic vote, but you've got to wonder if people are going to start reacting against BDS so publicly. It's got to be, like I said, I think it's got to be concerning to those who support current Israeli politics that this is a new threat, or at least a new way to potentially force Israel to some sort of negotiated solution, not completely on their terms.
Right. So I was going to say too, we had mentioned before the failed Camp David summit. It wasn't the Israelis who walked away from the table; it was the Palestinians. Yep. So if we're going to say that BDS is kind of the, I guess, civilian version of an economic sanction. How effective can that be, really, if even economic sanctions are only effective maybe 30% of the time?
It's a valid, it's a very valid point, and I don't think it will. I don't think it will be as successful as supporters of BDS want, but I think it will at least help reframe the issue in terms more favorable to them.
Right.
But you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, even if it was a major economic impact on the Israelis, they're not going to give up. There's still U.S. support. There's still a desire to, an understandable fear of they look at the region and they say, okay, we fought several wars. We're not giving up land that we've bled for.
Right.
So you're right. I don't think in and of itself it will solve anything. I just find it interesting that it could be a jumping off way of reframing this issue.
So what would it reframe the issue kind of to, if that?
Yeah. And it kind of gets back to some of the stuff we've talked about earlier, that maybe instead of looking at a two-state solution as the only solution, there needs to be an acknowledgement that has probably failed. Unfortunately, we're here now, and you don't put the genie back in the jackbox in the box, or whatever term you want to use, back in the bottle. Yeah. So you're here now. Perhaps a one-state solution is the only actual solution. And how do you make it work in a way that has a functioning democracy that represents everyone, but still recognizes that at its core, Israel is a Jewish state, and it was designed as such because of the atrocities of the Holocaust. And I don't think the supporters or opponents of BDS have all the answers, but like I said, I find it interesting, and it's a potential new way of looking at this issue.
Okay. So we were talking earlier about how the Senate, they did that symbolic vote for it, and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar are all about BDS. TPUSA is over here like, BDS is bullshit.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of thinking, what are your opinions on the Senate's stance with BDS? Is it going to be something that ultimately fractures the Democratic Party? Are we gonna fracture maybe Trump's evangelical base by doing that?
So I think it's like most things Mitch McConnell does. It's really, or allows to happen. It's really smart politics. You could argue though, back in the day, there's always the sayings of like politics stop at the ocean's edge. Well, that's clearly dead now. It's been dead for a long time. But no, I think it's really smart. It was really smart politics by the Republican Party, because it forces Dems to then take a stand that could be used against them by a primary challenger. If they don't, if they vote for it, then obviously they could potentially open themselves up to a primary challenger.
Right.
If they oppose it, that's a talking point to be used against them in a general election, where many people are very sympathetic towards Israel, and it opens a politician up to extra criticism, right?
Right, and then makes them have to commit and put it on paper.
Absolutely, yeah. And we've already kind of talked sort of about the fracturing that is already going on, and it just makes it a little bit more out there when you have Dems splitting basically their votes half and half on the BDS issue. So it is really smart politics. I do think at the end of the day, though, no matter how this plays out, there are so many unifying factors for the Dems, or at least there's one huge orange-tinted unifying factor for the Dems. Like, no matter how this plays out, ultimately at the end of the day, they will coalesce in the next election just to beat Trump. Now, post that, I think it's absolutely going to continue being a wedge issue for the Democratic Party. Just like Medicare for All is, and a few others. And then how much will it weaken the party? I don't really know, but you're absolutely right. I mean, you've got some very public supporters of Israel within the Democratic Party, and you've got some very, very critical members, especially in some of the newer House members that are very, very critical against Israel. And
so critical that I've even been like caught aback. Like, oh wow, that was that was borderline anti-Semite kind of stuff.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I don't know. Actually, I'll say, that Nancy Pelosi is hating this, because when she has junior members of her caucus going out there and saying things that don't play well in most of the United States, we're not talking about Trump not releasing taxes, or we're not talking about, the Senate not taking up things passed in the House. We're talking about potentially anti-Semitic comments, or at least really politically stupid comments that
right,
don't help the party. Exactly.
Right.
They don't help the party nationally.
Right.
So, no, it's smart by McConnell and company, and I wouldn't be surprised if they brought it back up again at some other point in the future. Just like they used to, the House when the Senate was controlled by the Dems would keep bringing up repeal Obamacare,
right?
Because it's just a nice little thing to put on Fox News and to remind some of your base why they voted for you.
Right,
so,
exactly.
Yeah.
I guess that makes sense. So, as somebody who is primarily sympathetic to Democrats, how do you feel about this new left-wing base like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and these comments? Like, because I feel like I am just this far right of center, but I am also very liberal on a lot of social policies, obviously. But I'm looking at them like I want to shake them and get them the hell out of there.
Yeah.
I feel like they're making everything worse.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you. Yes. Even if I didn't say what I was politically, I think you can kind of read through the tea leaves and what I've said here today. Mm-hmm. But that being said, I've voted bipartisan. I hope to keep doing that in the future. Mm. It's a little more difficult in this current environment, but it's something I really want to do. I don't want to get pigeonholed with any one party. But you're absolutely right. It turns off potential voters or supporters of their own cause, actually. And there are definitely smarter and more nuanced ways of talking about this issue that are respectful to both sides, and they're not doing that. And is it Newton's third law of physics? For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Mm-hmm. You get someone like Trump, should you be too surprised if there are now more voices coming out that are just as uncouth, that are just as oversimplified, mm-hmm. that are just as inflammatory as the very person they oppose? And I give them credit that insofar that we're talking about the issue,
right,
which I think is good. I mean, it had this whole visit fiasco not happened, I don't know if we would, and I don't know if we're not going to solve anything here, but at least
right.
it's forcing the discourse, and
right.
and so that is a positive. But I would point out, like, I don't blame Israel at all for not giving them entry into...
Right, they're legally allowed to do it, actually.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. Now, Trump, as he normally does, just made a situation worse by publicly getting himself involved. Because had they just quietly done it... Yeah, exactly. Because during the 80s, the South African regime would repeatedly deny requests of black congressional members who wanted to go to South Africa. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not trying to equate the two, but I'm just saying, as you know,
it's just a similar situation.
Every nation has well within its rights to say, no, we don't want this delegation. And I'll be honest, if I was an Israeli policymaker and I looked at that itinerary, I wouldn't let them go in either.
Yeah, I would have said no to
And I think it was...
It even said, like, visiting Palestine, like not even visiting Israel at all.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And then it was unfortunate because then after, the whole grandmother thing came up, and then they're like, okay, you can come in for humanitarian... I feel like if you're going to play poker and they're going to call you gotta go through with it at that point in time if you're mm-hmm. claiming it's partially for humanitarian reasons. So no, in the end, I don't blame Israel at all. It's just it looks bad on us as a nation if you're going to have your president repeatedly play or try to get foreign nations involved in internal partisan issues.
Yeah, that's true. I feel like it gives a little bit too much of a leverage handle to outside forces that we don't need involved in our politics whatsoever.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, because had it been, Nancy Pelosi and a few other, I guess establishment Democrats, I don't think the Israelis would have stopped it. They would have had no reason to. And
right. Because just before that, they had like 70 congressional members go to Israel, and it wasn't until Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar wanted to do humanitarian stuff, they said no, and then Rashida Tlaib was like, oh, I want to visit my grandmother or whatever. Yeah. And so they were like, oh, you want to visit grandma? Fine. Yeah. Come visit grandma. And then she was like, no, I'm not visiting grandma. And I was just kind of like, ooh, that doesn't look good. That doesn't look good at all. She basically should have just laid her cards out at that point and been like, yeah.
Well, and that's the problem when you get freshman Congress people. They can easily walk into traps or they just set themselves up to look bad publicly.
Yeah. And I feel like AOC has done that numerous times. I feel like Ilhan Omar has done that a couple of times, and Rashida Tlaib is just following suit with that. And I feel like it's like a metastasizing issue, and I'm so upset that it's primarily female Democrats that are doing this. It's not male Democrats, and I hate to say it like that, but like, man, if you're gonna be a female, you're gonna be a junior, and you want to have all of the public attention, then you better be smart. And if you're not smart, stop talking. Yeah. Because you're just going to ruin the Democratic Party, and I don't want that.
Right. I mean, the one thing we always have to remember is, even though it doesn't play well nationally, it can still always play well within their district. And ultimately, at the end of the day, they are smart if it does that. Like,
right, because then they just get reelected.
A horrific racist. And even the Republicans want Steve King to go away, but he keeps winning his district. So,
right.
Who's dumb? Is it the people who vote for him? Sorry, Iowa District 3 or whatever it is. But like, is Steve King dumb, or is it the people who vote for Steve King dumb because he keeps doing really racist things, but it works in his district? So,
right.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, just as much as Steve King hurts the Republicans, I would argue the Squad.
Yeah, the Squad, the infamous Squad.
Yeah.
I'm like, no.
I mean, I guess it plays well for Nancy Pelosi, because instead of Fox News spending 20% of their day trying to get people to hate her, they spend 20% of their day trying to get people to hate the Squad now. Right. So I guess maybe they're good for taking political fire. But you're right, it does hurt.
If I was Nancy Pelosi, I'd be using them as a shield, certainly. Yeah. Like, get them, not me.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, that's pretty much all I had for you today. I really enjoyed talking to you. That was awesome.
Yeah, thank you. I had a lot of fun. Yeah. I appreciated this. Sorry to have corporate coffee in here.
Oh, I don't mind.
No one saw that.
No one saw that. All right. Well, it was good talking to you, Jeremy.
Thanks.
Yep.